Hello and welcome to the 2007 Magic the Gathering World Championships. I'm Randy Bueller. I'm here with Brian David Marshall. We are at the Javits Center in New York City. The Pro Tour made its debut here 12 years ago in New York City.
You've made it, Sam. You did it. Sam, you did it. Are you happy about that?
Man, I'm happy.
You don't know how happy you're going to be when you see this. A new car!
Welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. Once won an all-expenses-paid trip to Taipei Maddox.
I did. I was wondering what you were going to say I won, but that's a deep, deep callback from years and years ago.
I was trying to think of other things you have won in contests, and I was struggling. I feel like you're not one to enter contests, really.
At least not to win contests.
How many have you entered, though?
I guess the one.
You won that one. That's good.
I don't know if I get the relevance, though, but here we are.
Well, here's the relevance, Anthony. We are not alone in this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. We're joined by a very special guest. He's a seasoned professional Magic player with so many GP and Pro Tour top 8s that I couldn't even find a conclusive number online. He's also the host of the Drafting Archetypes podcast, and what I really want to highlight is that he apparently won a car in 2007 by playing Magic. It's Sam Black. Hi, Sam.
Hi. Yeah, I kind of did do that.
Tell me about this winning a car thing. I need to know more about this immediately.
Yeah, so at Worlds in New York, the grand side events prize was a car. And the way this worked was there were a bunch of tournaments that you could enter on like Friday and Saturday that were marked room in the like event sheet or whatever. And players who won those events qualified for a 32-person tournament on Sunday that was a standard tournament. And the entirety of the prize support for that 32-person standard tournament was a car. So winner got a car.
That just went to the top place. It wasn't divided out to, second place gets the steering wheel and...
Right, no, second place got nothing, first place got a car. And,
so it's literally like Glengarry Glen Ross. You know, the top seller gets a Buick and everyone else gets nothing. You get fired.
Yeah. In practice, I never actually acquired a physical car. It was set up such that the winner had their choice of a car or $20,000, and if they chose the car, they needed to pick it up at a later date in person in New York, and pay taxes on the retail value of the car. And I didn't really need a car, and trying to acquire it and pay taxes on it and then sell it seemed like a lot of work, so I just took the money. And while there was no official prize for any place other than first, I had some splits with some of the other players. I think I had a 10% split with a friend going into the tournament, and then also made a small split in the top 4 with the other competitors. But I won a good portion of the money for the car.
I think you can say you won a car. It's amazing. Old Magic tournaments just hit different. The idea that it was I'm just picturing you playing at a table and next to you is a brand new Camaro or whatever, just sitting on the floor next to the draft table. It's a beautiful thought. That's really something.
Yeah, the deck that I won that tournament with was also something.
What were you playing?
I was playing goblins, but not like any goblin deck you're familiar with. This was Sunday at Worlds, meaning that the Swiss portion of Worlds had concluded. The top 8 portion of Worlds was happening. This was Worlds in New York in 2007. This is the event with the famous Hat-Shapen versus Gabe Nassif Dragonstorm mirror.
Yep.
Dragonstorm was the breakout deck of that tournament. Bob Maher, among other people, talked to me before playing on Sunday and told me I should play Dragonstorm. It's a great standard deck. And I was like, nah, I'm good. I'm going to play the Goblin deck that I played at States and didn't do especially well with. And this deck featured cards like Bogart Shenanigan and Mudbutton Torchrunner and Marsh Splitter and Mad Auntie and Knucklebone Witch. So all the Goblin staples.
All those good Lorwyn goblins. Known for being the most powerful goblins of all time, the Lorwyn goblins.
Yeah, Squeaking Pie Sneak. I came to game.
Well, as much as I would love to just hear more war stories from your early days of playing Magic, we do have you on to talk about something in particular, and that is an article you wrote for Star City Games almost exactly 2 years ago now, which is titled Elvish Visionary versus Elderfang Disciple, The Nature of Card Advantage. And the title, I think, kind of buries the lead a little bit, because really what you're describing here, which I think is the most important takeaway from this article, is your distinction between what you describe as big and small games of Magic, which is not something I had heard anybody describe prior to reading this article. Can we start by just having you maybe describe what you mean by big and small games of Magic?
Yeah, I think you're right that I maybe should have titled that article differently.
I didn't know, honestly, if you titled it, or a lot of times, No,
it is true that often my titles have been changed, and this might be evidence of why. But I did title it. And yeah, I certainly think that to the extent that that article contributed the language of large and small games to kind of the Magic vernacular, that was probably, the significant thing that it was doing, and maybe should have been in the title. But
maybe hard to tell before publishing, maybe hard to tell exactly how it's going to be received and what impact it's going to have.
Sure. Yeah, but basically the idea is that big games are games that are resource heavy, and small games are games that are resource light. That often means, big games have like a lot of objects, usually creatures in play, and small games don't. In general, small games are more likely to come down to attrition in some way, although that's not always the case. Famously, for example, I would say like historical Rug Delver in Legacy is kind of the de facto small game deck,
right,
with just tons of 1-for-1s, and it keeps the board to like 3 permanents a lot of the time because of like wastelands and really cheap creatures and dazes and Force of Will. You're really, really good at just destroying resources left and right. All the cards end up in the graveyard. But that deck is also kind of a quintessential tempo deck. Another key thing that I talk about a lot in terms of like general Magic strategy is tempo and attrition, and the fact that I consider them opposite ends of a spectrum, where fundamentally, attrition is about using up all of your opponent's resources, and tempo is about winning before your opponent can use all of the resources that they still have. These are separate axes, the big game versus small game and the tempo versus attrition. So while there may be some tendencies or correlation where small games can line up with attrition, as exemplified by Rug Delver, that's not always the case.
Yeah, I really like your definition of tempo there, and I feel like a lot of seasoned Magic players or people that write a lot of articles have a slightly nuanced, they have their own kind of nuanced definition of tempo, and I think yours is really straightforward and clear. And you're right that at first, when I read this article, when I first saw it, I kind of thought, okay, well, this is just different words to describe the same thing, but it is actually different axes, right? The big game, small game versus tempo and attrition. And there's also the question in there of high resource and low resource games, which I think is very often, like you said, correlated with big and small games. But you also gave an example in the article of a game with the Howling Mine on turn 1, which has big hands, so that's like a big resources in terms of one sense, and then players get to use all their mana on every single turn, so it ends up being a game that prioritizes tempo. So there's all these kind of related ideas that are all kind of muddled together, and they have overlapping correlations between each other. But I think this particular descriptor of big and small game is just really useful to understand what matters in a game of Magic.
Yeah, and certainly like the more that they print cards like Lorana the Third Path, where you just kind of get this free ability to tap to make both players draw a card, it's just like, do you want this game to be bigger or not? And it's, difficult to figure out, like, who is advantaged by this, when, why, how, and if you have like a more robust understanding of the significance of like the size of a game, it's easier to, have heuristics about when you should be using it.
Lauren is a really good example because that's exactly like you said. It's a card that has value unto itself, right? As like a white Reclamation Sage. Then strapped onto it as like a totally optional thing. It's just a do you vote for a big game button, and you can choose to press it or not. And I remember during spoiler season, preview season, people were like, is that good? Do I ever want to do that in a white aggressive deck? Like, what is the value of that activated ability? And I think that this article does a really good job explaining that in the abstract.
Right. And I mean, like, it can't be the case that you never want to do it, right?
Sure,
like,
not never, yeah.
If you're just some portion of the time, you'll just be definitively dead, but there's a card in your deck that could save you, and at that point you should probably click, potentially change the game.
I'm not a great Magic player, but I do like to take any line that doesn't guarantee I lose. I think that's a good first level. First, just from a player perspective, right? Just thinking as a player trying to win games of Magic, you talk about how understanding whether your deck wants a big or small game is kind of the first level to navigating this thought technology. What are the kinds of decks that want a big or a small game in general?
Most high synergy decks, like tribal decks, want big games because you have cards that scale off of your other cards, and the more of them are in play, the more they're pumping each other. So that's a good, standard, I'd like a big game, please. Also, decks that have global effects. Sleep is maybe like top tier example of that in Limited. Anything that, suddenly your opponent can't block no matter what they have. Those cards are way, way, way better in big games because, it's just, I win if total power equals your life total, and the bigger the game is, the more likely that's going to be true.
And also, a card like Sleep, the card literally does more the more your creatures your opponent has in play. The card itself is more valuable. Still costs the same amount of mana whether your opponent has 1 creature or 40 creatures, so in a game where you're getting a lot more off of that, it's going to play a lot better.
Yeah. Then decks that want small games are decks that have a lot of 2-for-1s, where you're better at pulling out of that, and decks that, are just like single powerful cards. Cards that don't rely on support of other things. Creatures that people put in Jund decks. Like, Jund is a bunch of, efficient 1-for-1 removal. Those are like the easiest way to vote for a small game. Liliana of the Veil might be like the definitive small game card.
Yeah.
And then Jund is just,
2 drops that will kill you dead
games.
All alone.
Yeah.
2 drops that will solo the whole game. And then you touched on this in the article, but I think one of the interesting questions about any dichotomy like this is what happens when you come up against an opponent and both your decks, prior to the match beginning, are decks that were constructed to vote for a smaller big game. How do you then navigate the idea of, okay, we're both playing a small game strategy. Is there an edge to be gained by trying to go bigger, trying to, outsmall your opponent who's also trying to go small? Is that some...
I mean, for the most part, if both decks are serious about doing one of these things, then the game is just going to be that. And it's just about, who operates better in it. If you have 2 different tribal decks, then it's just, okay, which one of us is scaling better here?
Right.
If you have, 2 Jund decks, it's who gets more 2-for-1s, who draws the right number of lands, who, sticks a threat. You're going to be playing the game in accordance with the principles of the kind of game that the decks push to, and the winner is going to be the person who wins on the terms of those kinds of games.
Sure, so a lot of times it's not that you're trying to navigate that spectrum. You're not saying, well, I'm going to go bigger if my opponent's trying to go small to try and counteract them. You're just, all right, we're operating under these terms of engagement.
Yeah, exactly. It's just about identifying and understanding and operating under the terms of engagement, and if both decks can only make the game go one way, then the terms of engagement are very, very clear from the outset. Whereas, if you have a Jund deck versus a Howling Mind deck, I often describe what's happening in a game of Magic as the 2 players are trying to control the narrative and make the game about what their deck is about. And so in the Jund deck versus the Howling Mind deck, someone is going to come out on top there. Usually, in my experience, the Jund deck is going to have Thoughtseizes and Abrupt Decays to take away the Howling Minds, and the Howling Mind deck isn't going to function.
Right.
And the Jund deck will dictate the terms of engagement there. Whereas if instead of a Howling Mind deck, it's a deck with a bunch of sorcery that draw extra cards, then you're a lot more likely to end up in a spot where the Jund deck is trying to make it a small game, and the other player is nah, I'm not about to run out of resources.
Yeah, it's sure, 1-for-1 me, that's fine. I will just beat you in a long game by having more cards.
Right. And that's where the Jund deck ends up needing to try to play a tempo game with their, hard-hitting early creatures, when the Jund deck is usually set up to play an attrition game.
I guess one thing I'm trying to wrap my head around is, I think at first, even just based on the names, big and small game, it might seem like there is some correlation or relationship to like the aggro mid-range control spectrum, that like rock paper scissors, where you kind of always want to be one step bigger than your opponent. But really, decks can prioritize big or small games at any part of that aggro mid-range control spectrum.
Right. It's the same thing as the like tempo versus attrition spectrum, where like the reason this language exists is because it's different than the other things.
Right. Exactly. I know for me, at least, when I think about tempo, I kind of have like two ideas of tempo in my head. And the first one is like line for line, letter for letter, your definition of tempo in this article, right? It's mostly about like mana and turns, right? Like, am I able to use all my resources and just maximize all of the things I have access to end the game before my opponent gets to use all their resources? I think there's kind of a related but maybe different idea of tempo, which is just life total, right? Like the race, like how close are you to dying regardless of how efficient your card usage is or whatever. And I noticed that in this article, you talk a lot about the abstract level of, managing mana in turns and that kind of tempo. But like a life total, I don't think is mentioned at all in the article, or the idea of a race. How does life total play into big or small games, if at all? Or is it just that it's another variable that big and small games can care about or not?
Right. So I think it's just a different thing. When life total matters immediately is when the end of a game is in sight. And when the end of a game is in sight and life total matters, then the game becomes about that, right? Like, you're dead in 3 turns unless you find an answer, and then the game becomes, let me, like, change this outcome. But I think this, like, the big game versus small game thing is for, like, the point of the game where that's less certain.
More in like the developing turns of the game.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about sort of like there are moments where you want to draw a card because there's a concrete out to a game. Like, you can see literally the end of the way the game will resolve. This is more about like a heuristic about how do you want to structure sort of the whole texture of the game towards making your cards actually work in the way that you expect them to.
Right. Even if you're a small game deck that plays Lauren and you don't expect to draw cards very often, you'll still find yourself in that position where it's like, well, regardless of my overall abstract strategy for this game, now there is a much more concrete ending in sight, and I can abandon the more abstract ideas and instead just say, well, I'd lose unless I draw this card right now. And so even though in the abstract I might not want to be playing a big game, this gives me an out that I otherwise wouldn't have.
Right, and notably, Lauren is, on its surface, a small game card, right? Like, it is an Elderfang Disciple, not an Elder Visionary. Like, it comes into play and another object leaves instead of creating another object.
Right.
So it's interesting there that, like, the card that they put the I can vote for a big game on, and this card naturally votes for a small game when you cast it card.
Yeah, I mean, are there a lot of other cards or situations or decks that you feel like sort of have to play that kind of like swing player where it is about just finding, depending on your particular opponent, your particular matchup, or the particular board state, you end up voting in one direction or the other?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Mid-range decks in Magic are kind of like, their thing is flexibility, and that can, manifest in a lot of different ways. Take like a card like Abzan Charm that is removal or draw 2, mode that votes for small game and mode that votes for big game on that card.
Right.
There's a card that I sometimes point to as one of my favorite cards because of what playing with and against it taught me about Magic. And that's Jace Beleren, the original Jace, one of the first 5 Planeswalkers from Lorwyn.
Yeah.
That was like, when it was first printed, like, no one had any experience playing with Planeswalkers. It was one of the first 5. And there are a couple of different ways to play this card. It's +2, both players draw a card, -1, you draw a card. And -1, you draw a card is an effect that's, stronger in small games, because that's just how drawing a card works. The fewer cards there are, the larger percent of impact that has. And +2, both players draw a card is a card that votes for a big game. Both people get cards, and also, like, you're adding loyalty to this Planeswalker, which is sort of an extra, object or fraction of an object in play. It keeps the Planeswalker around better. When Jace was, like, first spoiled, and people who I was aware of were, like, thinking about it and talking about it, it was like, okay, so this is a way to, like, get some card advantage, right? Like, you play this, and if you can protect it, you, like, draw a couple of cards, and then maybe at some point you have to, like, give your opponent a card, but obviously you wanted to, like, get ahead on cards first, and then you just use the plus so that you can minus it some more. that was kind of a like level 1 card advantage type theory that is very much like applicable in small games. And then where I really learned about this card was playing against Masashi Oiso, one of the best players ever, Japanese pro, at Worlds. We were playing a Fairy Mirror, and I had Bitter Blossom and he didn't. And the conventional wisdom about the Fairy Mirror is if one person has Bitter Blossom, they're an overwhelming favorite to win the game. And he played Jace and just used the +2 ability every turn. I had never seen anyone use that play pattern with that card. And what doing that did is it increased life totals because I couldn't ignore the Jace. So my fairies had to be attacking the Jace, and it increased resources. And he was able to use the extra time and cards that the Jace bought to like use cryptic commands to stop my fairies from doing anything and like have my Bitter Blossom plus his fairies kill me. I learned from that both that, what I kind of already knew. Fairies is one of the best big game decks ever because you have like these fairy tokens that scale with like your Scion of Unas. You have like a lot of synergy in your creatures, your like spell setter sprites counter more things the more cards there are in play. You have like a lot of really, really cheap interactions, so if both players are drawing a lot of extra cards, you're just going to be able to cast more spells than your opponent. And then you also have Cryptic Command, which is, the sleep thing that we were talking about.
Yeah, Cryptic Command's a great big game card for sure.
Right. And so the fact that Jace was actually really powerful for its Howling Mine mode, and like that was like just playing it in Fairies as, yeah, we're just going to play a big game, and I have a card that's like just a good card that's really, really good at making this a big game. Like I had not been playing Jason Fairies until that moment, and played Jason Fairies all the time that I played Fairies after that because like voting for a big game was just so strong. And then, if your opponent couldn't contest it, then, sure, sometimes you minus it, but you're just so happy to just plus it every turn.
Is it also kind of fair to say maybe that in that situation, given that Bitter Blossom is so powerful and so important in that deck, your opponent already has one in play, the more cards you both have access to, the sort of relative less impact that one card's going to have on the game, right? Like if you imagine
and also,
we're both Hellbent and you have a Bitter Blossom, then obviously you're an overwhelming favor to win. Meanwhile, if we both have a bunch of cards in hand and we just keep drawing more and more cards, then the relative impact of that one outlier is just lessened.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And that's really fundamental to, big game versus small game is like the bigger the game is, the less the impact of any single card is. Bitter Blossom is certainly, the kind of card that is really good in a small game. That's why, despite the fact that, Fairies is like a deck that likes big games, it's also a deck that plays a lot of efficient 1-for-1s. You're like a deck with like Thoughtseizes and counterspells and stuff, and a lot of your cards are about making the game smaller, which is unusual for a tribal deck, right? Usually tribal decks can't afford to play a bunch of like 1-for-1 interaction, but Bitter Blossom is such a small game card that you can.
Right, Bitter Blossom just carries so much by making so many permanents that you can have the rest of your deck be more about 1-for-1 interaction and still essentially have a like big deck.
Right, and the other thing about having both players draw cards in that spot is you're drawing both players into their next Bitter Blossom, and that means that, he can eventually find a Bitter Blossom to get parity, whereas it's really, really dangerous to have multiple Bitter Blossoms in the Fairy Mirror because your life just goes down so quickly, and then it just becomes really easy to like die to Cryptic Command.
Bitter Blossom is one of my favorite cards. I just love that tension of you're getting a huge advantage on board, but also TikTok, your life is going away. Like you have to end this game in some way, otherwise it will eventually get you. I'm just such a sucker for cards like that. I love small games. I mean, honestly, your article was first introduced to me by Parker, who's an often contributor to our show and a friend of the show, and when he sent it to me, I was like, this is the best description for what I want my cube that I curate to play like. I tried other ways to describe it over the years of like, it's a very low curving cube or it's a very aggressive cube or whatever, just trying to like describe what it was. And really what I wanted to get at was small games, because there are always exceptions to I'd be like, oh, it's a low curving cube, but I like, X card over here that costs more mana. And people would be like, well, you say it's a low curving cube. Why are you playing this big expensive card? And in reality, it's because usually those expensive cards are still voting for small games in a similar way. So I kind of want to transition from talking about big and small game as a player, just trying to win games and understand what's going on, and talk about it as cube designers. Anthony and I are both cube designers. We talk about cube a lot on this show. I know cube is a big passion of yours. And I'm curious to know, do you as a player prefer playing big or small games just in terms of like how much fun you have? Do you think you're better at navigating one or the other?
Yeah, I mean, when you said that your cube is about small games, my immediate thought was, oh, that's the opposite of my cube. I mean, my cube is a commander cube that is very much about, it's designed to make sure that all of the games last long enough that every player gets to like do their thing and have their moment where they're the threat. And so the card choices are exactly opposite of that. The card choices
I think you're right.
Like, we're going to make sure that there's just a lot of stuff happening, a lot of things in play. Every now and then there will be a sweeper, but then there will be a lot more stuff in play. I wrote an article that's not published yet last night about choosing like the expensive cards and the game-ending cards, and that like the cube is designed such that the game basically only can end after a lot of stuff has happened, because like the cards that are good at ending the game are things like Insurrection and Vicious Shadows that only win when there are a lot of creatures in play and they're big, and like the like add up the numbers, do total numbers equal life total type situations.
That seems like a great way to lock in big games. Just saying like, yeah, the actual win conditions are mostly only going to function if there's a big board. Like that's a pretty
right.
That's the luxury we have as people designing an environment to say like, no, I'm going to force you to play a big game because that's how you're going to win.
Right. Well, and the other thing is like, since it's Commander, it's really hard to get people to put 1-for-1 removal in their deck because it's just fundamentally so bad, right? Like you kill someone else's creature and then you dealt with the thing, but the other two people at the table are high-fiving because you both went, like you and the person you targeted both just went down a card.
Yeah, players C and D made out the best in that transaction by far.
Yeah, and like there's no way around that. Like if you put a Sword Supply Shares in your deck, you're just committing to being in the bad half of the table in that exchange. But having it in your hand gives you some political leverage. It can, convince people to attack not you instead of you, which is more or less of, mind control that costs you 0 mana. So they can also be strong, but you want a light touch of it, right? Like if having a Swords to Plowshares effectively mind controls like all the creatures at the table because they all do your bidding rather than like having you kill them, the second Swords to Plowshares isn't doing anything because you're getting all of your mileage out of threat of activation. So only like the absolute best of the best removal gets played, so decks have just a little bit of that, and so the games still end up being pretty big.
My experience in Commander 2 also says that like a lot of those cards come into play at those like otherwise game-ending moments. It's kind of like, all right, well, now you're going to die to this thing unless you've been sandbagging an answer the whole time. And that's when the removal gets used, right? Because again, in a multiplayer game, you're not going to out-tempo the entire table by removing a threat and just, getting in for a little extra damage here. So it's used very differently than in one-on-one constructed Magic.
Yes, absolutely. And also, that fact that like even when people have removal, they're not spending it until they absolutely have to means that like they're letting the game get big. They're not, even when they can 1-for-1, that's not what they're doing. That's not how they're prioritizing their mana. Everyone's kind of working on furthering their own game before they would think about like attacking someone else's game.
I gotta be honest, until we met you at CubeCon and talked about your cube a little bit, I was surprised when I heard that your like main cube and your like biggest passion project is this big Commander cube, just because I think the impression that I at least had, and I think a lot of people have, is that professional, very competitive players tend to not enjoy these like really big multiplayer game formats as much. Honestly, now thinking back on it, it's kind of like the perfect example of how Cube can be exactly what anyone wants, because I have played very little competitive constructed in my entire Magic career, right? I started playing more intensely, 8 years ago, and Commander was what everyone was playing. So I got into Magic and got invested in Magic by playing a ton of Commander. And then when I came to Cube, it was like, what I really want to do is play tight competitive one-on-one games that are small games with like really important decisions and that kind of stuff. And meanwhile, maybe you've just like had that in spades for your entire career playing competitive Magic for the past 30 years. And so the Commander Cube allows you to get like something else that isn't something that hasn't been as abundant for you, which it's just such a great example.
The story is actually a little bit different.
Oh, good. Well, hit me with it.
Yeah, so I have, been playing Magic since I was 12, which was, probably late 11, almost 12, which is about as long as Magic existed. So I started playing in 94, and I didn't play my first Pro Tour until 2005. So my childhood was a lot of like playing games at the youth center where we would play just like 9-player multiplayer games of, no one knows anything about Magic and everyone is just playing like, roughly sealed deck power level decks
that are
just like, here are the green cards.
Introduction.
I started playing like before the internet really existed. Like I would, get a physical book that would list the names of cards and I would read like, wow, there's a card in this game called Blaze of Glory. That sounds sweet. I wonder what it does. Oh, well, there's no way to know until I happen to see one in the world.
Incredible.
The classic pre-internet, guess I'll just not know things.
Yeah. But yeah, so, I grew up playing. When I was taught Magic, it was, my friend's older brother came over to my house while my, older neighbor was, watching over me. And then my, older neighbor, my friend, his older brother, and I, there were 2 starter decks. We literally just chopped them in half and played a 4-player game with 30-card decks where we didn't really understand the rules. And then, we just played multiplayer ever since. I didn't really, ever play one-on-one unless there were just only 2 of us who we could find. And that was, just what Magic was for me for the first few years. I guess, at some point, someone told me that, hey, the local store has tournaments. And I was like, oh, wow, that sounds awesome. I think I'm, relatively good at this compared to, my other friends.
Were you picturing just, all 12 people in the tournament sitting in one giant game and just playing with 12?
No, we knew about one-on-one and stuff. I didn't think it was going to be multiplayer. But, as soon as I found out the tournaments existed, I was like, yeah, I'm so in. The first tournament that I played in, I was playing, an 80-card deck of red, green, and black cards that I owned.
It sounds great. More cards is more options, more power, right?
I was going to say, weird. I didn't think Yorion had been printed yet, but maybe I have my timelines wrong. Maybe Yorion was around.
Yeah, no. It was not optimal. And I think I beat my first opponent. I think I just cast a Hypnotic Spectre and it won the game or whatever. And then my second round, I played against a player who later had the best rating in Illinois. When I played against him, he was playing a fully powered deck. Before balance was restricted, he was playing 4 balances.
Yikes.
With all the power library, a bunch of cards I'd literally never seen before that were way better than all the cards I had seen before. And that went about the way you'd expect. And I was hooked. I loved it. I wanted to get some cards like that and learn to make stronger decks. But for me, going to tournaments and I've recently come up with an accurate picture of my history that is a huge portion of the decisions that I've made in my life have basically just been dictated by what can I do that will allow me to play the most paper Magic. And when I, first heard about tournaments and started playing them, the thing that was exciting there was, oh, you're saying there's a time where I can go to a place and there will be people who are playing Magic. That's great because I didn't know that my friends would be available at that time, and I wanted to play Magic then because it was a time.
Checks watch. Yep, it's time to play Magic.
Yeah. And you said when you started playing, Commander was just what was up. That's not how it was when I started playing. When I started playing, if you wanted to play Magic in public, you were playing tournaments because that's the Magic that was organized in public. And with my friends, I played casual Magic, but in public, I played tournament Magic because that's how it worked.
And you just did both because both is more Magic.
Exactly. And you talk about oh, I had these ideas about competitive players. Yeah, that's because that's all true. I was never a competitive player. I was just a person who wanted to play Magic, and competing was the way to do that.
Yeah, that's always the best way to get really good at something is just to really love it, and you will by nature just get a lot of practice in.
Yeah. And I mean, I care about things that are like related to tournament success. Like I care about figuring stuff out and impressing people, but I don't care about beating people. I just care about what comes from that. And there are people who I think like care a lot about actually sitting down and defeating another person in a competition in a way that I really don't. And I think there are also people who hate losing in a way that like really drives them to win all of their matches in a way that I don't. I don't care at all if I lose.
So you're more like a Johnny, but your cool combo you want to show off is the fact that you win every match you play at CubeCon.
I suppose in a way, yeah.
It's very close to it, at least.
Yeah.
Well, something we've said on the show before, which I think lines up with this, is that I think Anthony and I consider ourselves like spikes for wanting to understand the game, right?
Right.
Like, neither of us play any digital Magic, and if we just cared about getting better at Magic, right, that's what we would do, because, like you said, when you were a kid, you couldn't play Magic whenever you wanted. You had to, like, make sure your friends were available or go to a tournament. Now, if you want, you can just boot up Arena and play Magic 24/7, but for us, that's just not fun. But we do care about, though, is really understanding the game, and hopefully understanding the game also comes along with maybe winning a couple more matches because you have a good understanding of the game, but it's not that the actual win rate is what we're seeking. We're seeking understanding and just, trying to grasp at this thing that is Magic.
Mm-hmm. I definitely, relate to that. Like, I care enough about Magic that I will also play digitally, but I also, even now, while I'm like, streaming Magic most days and playing a lot of Magic Online, I also prioritize physically going to the store and playing Magic not necessarily the store, but most nights I also play paper Magic.
Yeah. I saw you tweet a while ago that you believe you're a candidate for the person that has played the most paper Magic in all time, and I think that's a great thing to even think is possible, right? To even think that you're on that short list says a lot about your commitment to the game. Yeah.
Sorry, there was actually a question that was outstanding that I never answered.
Oh, go ahead.
We can circle back.
I've lost it too, so tell me what it was.
Yeah, so it was about whether I enjoy playing big games or small games more in terms of curating the experience. I mentioned, my cube is big games, and the history there that I was getting into was about the fact that for me, Commander Cube is more about I actually have this like history with casual games, and multiplayer games, and it's more about like reconnecting with the Magic that I played as a kid that I didn't have the opportunity to play while I was focusing on competitive Magic. But it's not about I've never done this. It's about kind of the like nostalgia and reconnecting to my past and stuff. I like these like big multiplayer games because the puzzle is more intricate. I get to really flex the skills that I have in terms of just literally tracking everything that's happening in a game. Like I'll, play a lot of multiplayer games where someone like loses track of like all the cards in play, because how would you track the 50 different cards in play, half of which you've never seen before?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's my typical experience in a Commander game is somebody plays a thing and then they say, okay, I do a combo, and then in response someone says, wait a minute, let's roll that back and I have a counterspell now that I understand what's going on. Like, I didn't want to know until I realized it was a threat.
Or the classic asking the table what you're supposed to remove. Like, have a removal spell. Someone that's been paying attention, tell me what is supposed to be removed now.
Right, and so like I've done a lot of, playing like Table Judge or whatever in a Commander game where I'm, it's not hard for me to like track everything that's happening and just keep track of the game state in a way that other people can like lose track of. So I like just like, oh yeah, this is, it's like effortless for me to just like know all of this, and that's a fun skill to flex. But also I like the number of options and amount of play that exists. Another article that I wrote recently was about, like, I saw some discourse on Twitter about how Commander can frustrate players who are, like, can frustrate competitive players, because in one-on-one, players in aggregate win half of their matches, and in 4-player games, players in aggregate win a quarter of their matches. And if you don't like losing, well, you're losing a lot more often, and that can be a frustrating experience. And then they talk about what is the most you can win a 4-player. You can what's the greatest percentage of the time that you can realistically expect to win a 4-player game? And I have never seen anyone else who estimates that the number is as high as my number. I think that it is very easy for me to imagine that the best players at playing multiplayer games can win a similar portion of multiplayer games to the portion that the best one-on-one players can win. Like if, the best one-on-one players are winning 70% of their matches, I also think that the best four-player games are winning 70% of their four-player games.
How does that pan out when you have all the best players in multiplayer games at the same table? Wouldn't it still gravitate towards that 25%?
Yes, obviously, if literally
There's
everyone
still a best
is
among
just
the
as
best,
good.
though, right?
Sure.
Right, like obviously, if everyone has exactly the same skill set, it plays exactly the same, they all win 25% of the time. But what I'm saying is that like the portion, like let's say your way of getting all the best players together is you hold a CDH tournament. I have not played in a CDH tournament yet. I don't know exactly how good the average CDH tournament competitor is, but my guess is that there is just a ton of room to be way better than other players, and just it is just very, very fundamentally obvious to me that there are the decision density and the breadth of options in multiplayer is just so much greater than in two-player.
A lot of opportunities to flex even minor differences in skill level because
Sure.
of the many more decisions that are being made. And,
Right. I mean, if you just think about like everything that happens as an opportunity to collect a little bit of extra percentage. And then you just add up all that extra percentage you collected by optimizing every single like micro decision, and you realize that you've just like stolen a whole lot of equity.
Yeah.
I'm interested to see how this shakes out because I think competitive EDH, CEDH, I think has been ascendant for a few years now, but for a big part of the time it's been ascendant. It's been during the COVID pandemic where people weren't playing in paper tournaments, and I'm curious to see as we see more and more CEDH events if there really is a like discernible like these are the best CEDH players and they rise to the top. Then I'm also curious, like once you have these people that are known as the best CEDH players, do they just get kind of like targeted at a multiplayer table? Like I'm really curious to see how these things shake out. But just earlier today, I haven't watched the video yet, but I saw in my YouTube feed that Brian Koval of Bosch and Roll just won the CEDH tournament, and it's like, yeah, we know he's a very good Magic player. Like he's proven. So
I would note that he won his second CEDH tournament. I did watch this video yesterday. Yeah, I think it was his second consecutive CEDH tournament with basically the same deck.
Right, and that would be, if it really was just like 25% win rate in any given pod, that would be extraordinarily statistically unlikely for Brian Koval to win two back-to-back CEDH tournaments. So, yeah, I think I tend to agree with you a little bit. A lot of the discussion I see around the win percentage thing, I think is tends to be even more focused on like casual tables, like how many should you be winning if you're trying to have these like rule zero conversations and not play the peaks of power level. But I agree. I think when you're a really good player and someone like you that actually can manage a big board, then that is a lot of opportunity for you to flex your skills.
Well, so the other thing is like, when I talk about like the win rate in Commander, and the discussion also includes casual Commander. So there it's like, well, if you're winning a lot, it's probably because you're just playing a much better deck. And it's like, well, what if I'm not? Like, remember, my point is that you can play, like, there's just more opportunity to leverage play skill. Like, what if we literally just open a bunch of precons, shuffle up who has which, and then play the game? Like, what portion of the time do you think I'm going to win that game? Like, if I just go to a random local store, sit down with 3 people who have never met me, choose the first 4 precons we see that they have for sale on the shelf, we shuffle them up, hand them to people, we sit down and play.
I put you in the high 90% to win those games, assuming, very importantly, that the people don't know you. I think if you sit down and people are like, hey, that's Sam Black, then maybe your win percentage goes down a little bit just because of people singling you out a little bit. But no, I think you're right. And then I think there's all sorts of interesting questions to have there surrounding casual Magic. Like, okay, well, if you, Sam Black, are such a skilled player that is able to navigate these big complicated boards so much, should you theoretically be playing a less good deck than everybody else so that the win rate is more even? I don't know. That's all this weird, like, kind of subjective conversation to be had around, like, what casual format is supposed to be. And that's not really... I certainly have nothing to weigh in on that in terms of what I think would make sense. But certainly a lot of interesting stuff to unpack there if you wanted to.
I think the easiest first step there is just figuring out what is going to keep the games fun for your opponents, and like whether you're playing with people who are only going to enjoy it if they're, winning 25% of the time.
Right.
Like, just how frustrated are your friends going to be if you keep winning?
Yeah. I think people's perceived frustrations that I think competitive players have with multiplayer formats is that they believe that, okay, if Sam Black is 75% better than every other player at the table. He should win this percentage of the games. And they perceive that as like not comporting with the idea of what casual Magic is meant to be. But I agree. Like, to me, that's like the epitome of what Cube is, right? You said, like, figure out who you're playing with and what they want to get out of the experience, and then deliver that. And if that means that you're playing with people that are only going to be happy if they feel like they're winning the percentage of the time they should win based on their perceived skill level in the group, that's very different than people that just want to do the cool thing their deck is supposed to do and have something interesting and novel happen in the game, and then that's what they're looking for out of the experience. Anthony, you've been nice and quiet over there most of this episode. I'm curious to know, so I say in my Cube description, ever since reading this article, that like I want my Magic Cube to focus on small games, mostly because I am not as good as Sam, and I find it frustrating in games where I feel like my strategic attention is being focused on just keeping track of everything instead of like knowing what all the options are and making the right strategic choice. That's just my own personal limitation, or the part of Magic I like to focus on is not that part that Sam described of like being able to keep track of everything that's going on. How does this idea, if at all, map to your approach to cube design in your regular cube?
I mean, I think that's a super valuable language to have as a cube designer. I think that very often we talk about how important it is to sort of state the goals for the kind of cube you're trying to create if you're looking for feedback, especially from other designers. But I feel like actually what that kind of goal setting looks like can be difficult. So this kind of technology of thinking about what kinds of games do you like in terms of big and small games is just a really valuable tool. So I appreciate having that, and like it has helped me think through the kind of games that I like a little bit.
Which are,
unfortunately, where I'm going to land for the regular cube is right in the middle, because it's just a regular cube. But I think that is very much an honest answer, because it is bigger games than in your main cube, where it is very much playing to the board. It's about getting creatures, it's about creatures that have synergies between each other, but it isn't to the extreme of the Commander cube, where you have these, huge complicated things. I do want board states to be manageable and understandable to people of my skill level. So yeah, I would say firmly in the middle of that spectrum, if that's not too much of a weasel answer.
Can you think of any spectrum that I could ask you about in the game of Magic the Gathering
that you would
not say the regular cube lands square in the middle of the bell curve?
If I don't, then I need to adjust the cube, right?
Okay. You're a very particular type of sicko, Anthony.
But yeah, I do think that's really a valuable tool for cube designers to think about. I also really appreciate this other thing that you touched on in the article about sort of the diminishing margins of a lot of these effects, where you do want to have cards that work in the same axis or on the same end of the spectrum that are all voting for the same kind of game. But eventually, you do end up with decks that are just really fragile if they're all focused in one direction. And I think that sort of balance of having effects that have diminishing margins and you want to at some point stop including the same kind of effects actually just is a really positive tension that leads to kind of much more diverse and interesting deck building. And same applies, I think, for cube design.
Yeah, and in particular, I really like trying to draft a deck that has those attributes we described about the Fairies deck from back in the day, where it's like, I'm going to have this mixture of 1-for-1 removal for the things that need to be 1-for-1 removed, and also these cards that can scale and go bigger when they need to go bigger. And so I have the most, like, agency to control my interaction with that axis on the fly. That's, I think, the part I really love about drafting a cube deck. It's part of the fun of like drafting a new deck every single time. It's like, How am I going to actually navigate this particular axis along with all the other axes that are out there?
Yeah, I think Fairies is kind of an interesting... Obviously, it played a lot of just like fundamentally great cards, right? Like Thoughtseize and Bitter Blossom were just among the most powerful cards in Standard at the time. But it's also just kind of amazing the extent to which that deck was defined by its ability to play both sides of every spectrum, right? Like it's a small game deck and or a big game deck, it's a tempo deck and or an attrition deck. Like it really was just like the most flexible dynamic deck that I can think of.
Yeah, I said I've played very little Constructed Magic. The only modern deck I ever had was years ago. I had a Fairies list when Fairies was like a B tier modern deck basically, because I love that idea so much. Well, so Sam, you are writing these days for Hipsters of the Coast and also for Eminence Gaming, right? I do want to point people specifically to your My Favorite Way to Play Magic Commander Cube article, which I think is a great introduction to your format and your philosophy behind how you build that cube.
Yeah, so that article is on Eminence, and that article is actually the first in a weekly series on my Commander Cube. I've written 2 other articles. I think one of them will be up by the time anyone can listen to this. That article is about choosing cheap cards for that cube and like the role of cheap cards in Commander Cube and to some extent in Commander, and also how a cube designer can use care about which cheap cards are included to kind of dictate the pace and structure of games that are played on the cube. And then the next article that won't be up for a while is the opposite end of the spectrum. I talked about that earlier, the article about the expensive cards and how the games end, and choosing which big effects are and aren't appropriate for the kind of experience I'm trying to create. My articles for Eminence in general are this series exploring my Commander Cube, and then the articles for Hipsters of the Coast is a series exploring my casual play, which, focusing on Commander-adjacent things, regular Commander, CDH, Pauper Commander. I'm probably going to touch on Oathbreaker and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this series of articles on Eminence Gaming. To be honest, I'm not a big Commander Cube person, so I don't play a lot of Commander Cube, but I think it's just great to have somebody who is so articulate, so clear thinking about game design, talking about a type of cube that is not just like the most powerful cards in Magic's history that we all draft.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a great series, and I've been pushing it around.
I definitely, the goal is to have it talk about just like a lot about curating a play experience, and I think a lot of that can be extrapolated to any other cubes. So while it is very much specifically about Commander Cube, and more specific than that, it's specifically about my Commander Cube, I do intend for it to have easy cross applications to other cubes and like game design in general and stuff like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think those lessons are very easy to abstract and apply to your own cube environment out there if you're listening, even if it doesn't resemble pragmatically the kind of Commander Cube that Sam is talking about. And also, of course, if you're listening to this podcast, you should also be listening to the Drafting Archetypes podcast hosted by Sam. We know that there's so many good Magic podcasts out there, but that's one of the great ones that everyone should be listening to.
Thanks. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to 100% of listeners. I try to, be pretty careful about what I suggest to people, making sure that I'm only suggesting things that are actually relevant to their interests and valuable to them. Drafting Archetypes talks about how to draft a particular archetype in the current limited format each week, does really like a deep dive on, here's the strategy you're trying to employ, here are the cards that help with that, anything else, here's how it's positioned in kind of the larger metagame of that limited format. Very, very dry educational podcast. If you're looking to build skills in Limited, regardless of whether you're playing that particular draft format, I do think it's another situation where there are a lot of cross applications, and I try to weave in general Magic theory and strategy lessons. But if you're not specifically trying to understand Limited better and, in the market for, a dry lecture about Magic strategy, then it might not be the podcast for you, and that's okay.
Yeah, I will say that I play very little Limited these days, like retail Limited, but I get a lot out of the show for the same reason that you said, like the abstract lessons are there. I think one of your unique skills as a writer, podcaster about Magic is just always speaking to that sort of abstract level of understanding the game and talking about more transportable lessons, which I think is a great virtue. So that's a great explanation of what the podcast is, so you will know, listener, if that's for you or not. Also, you can find you on Twitch, Twitter, anything else you want to promote, Sam?
No, I think Twitch, Twitter, and my articles. I mean, I have a YouTube channel, kind of, but I'm not sufficiently dedicated to it at this point, so whatever.
Safe to assume you'll be at CubeCon this year as well?
Pretty safe. I mean, it's very conveniently located.
Right.
Will you also have your Commander Cube with you?
Last year, I didn't physically bring my cube to CubeCon because of the structure of CubeCon. My cube was not one of the featured cubes, and CubeCon seemed to be very much about the event and kind of playing the featured cubes. And then what I did is I used the CubeCon Discord server to publicly invite people over to my condo after hours to play my Commander Cube. And I hosted a bunch of people who I hadn't met before and played a bunch of games of Commander Cube after CubeCon was over each night, and that was pretty fun, and I suspect that something similar would be how I would approach it next time. Although I suppose I should maybe have a discussion with organizers about whether we want to try to like work Commander Cube into the featured cubes, but it would take, some work to figure out like how that factors into the whole, tournament event thing.
My understanding is that they are trying to further emphasize sort of the side events and the more casual aspect, just because they do want to showcase a variety of cubes, even though it's difficult to fit that into an event structure. But regardless, I'd love to give it a try.
Yeah, if you needed another reason to go to CubeCon, you have a small chance of maybe getting to play Sam's Commander Cube with Sam. So just saying.
And what's 30% divided by a 10% chance of winning?
yeah, a 3% chance of winning probably, but you'll have a good time, and that's what really matters. And that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. The show is produced by Anthony and I calling up Sam on Discord and just picking his brain about all of his ideas about big and small games and Magic in general. Thanks for coming on, Sam.
Yeah, no problem. It's a fun conversation.